Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the sixth session in our ongoing series, Deadline and Death Sentence, State Violence and Indigenous Adivasi People's Resistance in India. My name is Lotika Singha, and I speak on behalf of International Solidarity for Academic Freedom in India and London Mining Network. Our series title, Deadline or Death Sentence, refers to the Indian government's stated goal of making the country Maoist-free by March 2026. Behind that administrative phrase lies a project of militarization and internal colonization waged against India's own indigenous and marginalized people in the name of national security. Over our previous 5 sessions, we have traced the contours of this violence in Bastar, the Adivasi heartland of India, where counterinsurgency, mining, and judicial complicity have fused into a permanent state of exception. We have seen how this violence is not incidental, but systemic, a product of neoliberal governance that treats lands, forests, and even communities as extractable commodities, and is part of a wider architecture of control that extends to Indian Occupied Kashmir and to civil society across the country, to just every site where people are demanding dignity, self-determination, and justice. Today's session, Scripting State Violence and the Criminalization of Resistance in Adivasi regions, Indian Occupied Kashmir, and civil society, aims to situate these struggles within a single continuum of repression, where the Maoist-free deadline in Bastar becomes a metaphor for the Indian state's broader colonial projects want to discipline territory, identity, and dissent through law, militarization, and propaganda. In each of these projects, we see the same script unfold: violence justified as governance, extraction sanctified as development, and resistance criminalized as threat. This session asks us to recognize those continuities, to understand how they sustain an increasingly authoritarian state, and to imagine solidarities capable of confronting it. We are honored to have with us today Mohammad Junaid, Kashmiri writer and assistant professor of anthropology at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts, whose work incisively maps the lived experience of occupation and the narratives that sustain it, and Suchitra Vijayan of the Polis Project, whose research includes interrogating the Indian state's systematic dismantling of civil society and its war on dissent. Before I hand over to them, let's hold in our thoughts those whose voices we cannot directly hear today. The Adivasi youth human rights defenders of Bastar, many of whom are in prison or live under constant threat of arrest, many from families scarred by the Salwa Judum pogrom. In recent years, these young human rights defenders, many from families scarred by the Salwa Judum pogrom, formed a powerful form of collective resistance. The peaceful Silja protest of May 2021 against a new armed police camp ended in police firing that killed 4 Adivasi villagers. Out of that grief and defiance emerged the Moolwasi Bachao Manch, or MBM, a youth-led decentralized movement demanding adherence to constitutional safeguards and genuine self-governance under the 5th schedule of India's constitution. Its courage inspired others across Bastar, the Adivasi Adhikar Bachao Manch, the Maad Bachao Andolan, and the Madhonar Andolan, all united in the defense of land, life, and dignity. Since 2021, around 36 MBM members have been arrested in false cases under the draconian Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, or UAPA, and the Chhattisgarh Special Public Security Act, or the CSPSA. As protests continued, despite such intimidation, the Chhattisgarh government turned to proscription, banning MBM on 30th October 2024, while accusing it of opposing development works and security camps. Before we move on, we'll watch a short film that offers a glimpse of what this resistance looked like before it was criminalized.
गोंडा का रास्ता नहीं चढ़ेंगे।
जो जन आंदोलन चल रहा है बस्तर में, 42 जगह में जन आंदोलन चल रहा था, वो भी कारपोरेटीकरण, सैनिकरण, मतलब ये जो माइनिंग के किला में वहाँ पे मतलब सारे चीज लेकर आते हैं।
बस्तर के इतिहास का शायद ये सबसे लंबा आंदोलन है। सुकमा के सिलगेर में 17 मई को एक कैंप के विरोध में उतरे आदिवासियों पर कथित तौर पर सुरक्षा बलों ने फायरिंग कर दी, जिसमें 14 साल के उइका पांडु, कोवासी वागल और उर्सा भीमा की मौत हुई। 40 से ज्यादा लोग घायल हुए। ग्रामीणों का कहना है कि 11 मई की रात को बगैर उनकी सहमति के कैंप बना दिया गया, जो अनुसूचित क्षेत्रों के लिए पंचायत विस्तार अधिनियम पेसा 1996 के तहत अवैध है।
295 लोगों को लाठीचार्ज किया गया। उसके बाद 17 मई को 3 ग्रामीणों के ऊपर कम से कम यहाँ पर पब्लिक थे 15,000 के आसपास, उस बीच में फायरिंग कर 3 ग्रामीणों को वहीं पर मौत की घाट उतार दिए गए पुलिस जवानों ने। इसीलिए हम बस्तर से पूरे पुलिस फोर्स वापस जाने की मांग भी किए हैं।
साल भर हो गए, कैलेंडर में तारीख बदली, दुनिया में मौसम, बारिश, ठंड, गर्मी, ये आदिवासी यहीं डटे रहे।
कैंप का ये लोग क्यों विरोध करते हैं? कैंप का इतना ऐसा समस्या है कि आप अगर जैसा बस्तर में एक सप्ताह भी रहेंगे तो आप शायद बहुत परेशान से रहेंगे, क्योंकि यहाँ से जहाँ वहाँ जाएंगे कैंप मिलेगा, वहाँ से वहाँ जाएंगे कैंप मिलेगा।
महिलाओं पर महिला जंगल में जाते, लकड़ी उकड़ी मछली उछली पकड़ने जाते, पत्ता तोड़ने जाते, महिलाओं को भी, गर्भवती महिलाओं को भी कहीं ना कहीं बीच मिलते हो, उसको पकड़ के बलात्कार अत्याचार करते हैं सर।
बस्तर में मतलब लोकल गांव में कैंप नहीं लाना है कर, रोड बनाते बनाते क्या कर रहे, अब कैंप ला रहे, कैंप लाने के बाद क्या कर रहे, फॉरेस्ट वाला आ रहे, पूरा जंगल को जब्ती कर रहे, खेती मन को पूरा, हम फिर पूरा जब्ती करने के बाद हम कहाँ जाके जिएंगे, ऐसा। इसलिए परिस्थिति को देख के हम संघर्ष कर रहे हैं।
उसी मुद्दे को लेकर हम लोग आज तक का 2 साल पूर्ण हो गया, अभी डटे हैं। आज तक कोई सरकार सुनवाई नहीं की।
गांव में जैसे अभी पुलिया निर्माण हो रहा है, पुलिया बनने के बाद रोड कैंप जाएगा, उसके बाद फिर महिलाओं के ऊपर बहुत अत्याचार होगा। हम लोग जो मांग लेकर उनको, जो मांगों को लेकर हम उनके पास जाते हैं तो वो मांगे हम पूरी नहीं कर देते हैं। जैसे हम लोग को हो गया आंगनबाड़ी, हॉस्पिटल, स्कूल। हम
रोड को विरोध नहीं करते हैं, रोड हमारे आदिवासी की जितना जरूरत है उतना ही मांग करते हैं। आदिवासी के हाथ में सिर्फ ट्रैक्टर है, बाइक है, साइकिल है, बैला गाड़ी। इसलिए हम ये चाहते हैं कि आप एम्बुलेंस लाने के लिए जितना आवश्यकता उतना एक रोड बनाइए।
अस्पताल आजकल तो ऐसा हो गया, जहाँ पर कैंप है उसी जगह में डाल दिया जाए। सोसाइटी बिल्कुल ऐसा ही हो गया, सोसाइटी हुआ, हॉस्पिटल हुआ, और वहाँ पर तुम्हारा विकास कर रहे हैं बोल के हॉस्पिटल मन को भी वहीं कैंप मन में डाले हैं। करके हमारे ऊपर प्रेशर, दबाव एनी टाइम डालते रहते हैं। कल ने हम सूचना देने के लिए मुकुर कैंप में गए थे, तब बोले कमल किशोर ने, तुम्हारा समय जब आएगा तुम लोग को तुरंत उठा के जेल में ढकल दिया जाएगा।
हमारे जो प्रतिनिधि थे, जो 40-42 जगह में आंदोलन चल रहा था, उसमें से हमारे सर्वादिवासी समाज के उपाध्यक्ष सुरजू टेकम, उसके बाद सुनीता पोट्टम, गजेंद्र मंडावी, सुरेश अवलाम, जो मतलब बाकी बहुत सारे लोग हैं, वहाँ पे कुछ भी धारा लगाकर कहीं भी मिले उसको सीधा जेल ही लेके जा रहे हैं। मतलब वहाँ जितने भी नेतृत्व करने वाले सभी को जेल लेके जाना ये पूरा निश्चित है। मतलब अब लिख के रख रहे हैं।
सुरजू टेकम दादा निर्दोष, जो आदिवासी थे, जो सर्व समाज के प्रदेश संपर्क जन आंदोलन में अगर आंदोलन कर रहे हैं तो धरना प्रदर्शन या रैली जुलूस कर रहे हैं, जो गाइड देने वाले ऐसे लोग को हमारे सरकार नजर रखती है, उनको पकड़ के ले जाना, गिरफ्तार करना।
जो आदिवासी समाज के नेता सुरजू टेकम जी को बिना शर्त तुरंत रिहा करना चाहिए और बस्तर में नारसार व झूठी मुठभेड़ों को बंद किया जाए। कांकेर जिले के गो में सुकमा जिले के ताड़मेटला जूटी मुठभेड़ों के लिए जिम्मेदार पुलिस अधिकारी व पर कार्रवाई करनी चाहिए। और एड्समेट्टा सरकनगुड़ा नारसारों तथा तिम्मापुरम मोरपल्ली ताड़मेटला में 252 घर को सशस्त्र बलों द्वारा जला दिया जाने के मामलों में जांच किया जाए कि सिपरिस तत्काल कार्रवाई की जाए। और ग्राम सभाओं की अनुमति के बिना इंद्रावती नदी पर पुंडरी वेदरे के पास शुरू किए गए पुलिया निर्माण कार्य को तत्काल बंद किया जाए, ग्राम सभा का आयोजन किया जाए। हम लोग आज ओरछा अंतर्गत अबुजमाड़ इलाका ओरछा ब्लॉक में हमारा आंदोलन चल रहा है। 2 दिन हुआ है। आज हम लोग यहाँ पर माड़ और यहाँ चक्का जाम किए हैं। जतिन दास शहादत दिवस का 1929 में शहीद हुए, उनका शहीद समारोह कर रहे हैं। याद करते हुए हमारे जेल बंदियों को रिहा करने का मांग रखे हैं। बोले वाले आदिवासियों को एफआईआर दर्ज करके तो वहाँ जेल भेजते हैं। जेल भेजने के बावजूद वहाँ सच्चाई व्यवस्था नहीं मिल रहा, सुविधा नहीं दे रहे हैं और जेल में बंद करके सालों साल रख रहे हैं। जो
तो मैं अपील करता हूँ सभी जितने भी यहाँ पे मानवाधिकार यहाँ सभी साथी, मैं बस्तर को एक बसाना है। इस तरह का मैं जितने भी बोला हूँ वो सभी हमारे आदिवासियों को समर्थन दे, मदद करे। और जो भी आदिवासियों के ऊपर अनन हो रहा है और मानवाधिकार को अनन हो रहा है, सभी को थोड़ा मदद करे, यहाँ से समर्थन दे।
तो मेरा कहने का है कि कहीं भी यूट्यूब हो या हर चैनल में सब्सक्राइब कीजिए और हमारे वीडियो को ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा शेयर कीजिए।
ये जो प्रतिबंध डाले हैं ये गैर कानूनी का है, क्योंकि हमारा जो संगठन है ये जल जंगल ज़मीन को लेकर लड़ने वाले संगठन है और खुला लड़ने वाले हैं। और ये जो प्रतिबंध डाले ये गलत है, शासन से भी मैं कहूँगा, क्योंकि ये सबके सामने और सबका सुझाव के साथ लड़ते हैं। और दूसरी बात ये कि हमारे जो मूलवासी बचाओ मंच के कार्यकर्ता जो प्रतिबंध लगने से पहले जो गिरफ्तारी किए हैं, जेल भेजे, उन लोग को निःशर्त रिहा करे। और दूसरा है कि हमारे आदिवासी लोगों का जो भी ये मांगे उसको मतलब हल करे, समस्या हल किया जाए। जैसा स्कूल, हॉस्पिटल, आंगनबाड़ी, ये सारा चीज़ है। और जहाँ जहाँ घटना हुआ उसके संबंध में भी हमारे मांगे, उसको भी हल करे किया जाए। और जो बस्तर में जो हमारे आदिवासी लोग के ऊपर हो रहा है वो समस्या कभी हल मतलब समाधान नहीं हो सकता है। घटना घटते रहेगी, बढ़ते रहेगी। तो है ये कि अभी जनता बोल रही है कि इस तरह का जो संगठन को प्रतिबंध नहीं करना चाहिए।
In February 2025, Raghu Midyami was also incarcerated despite being under treatment for injuries sustained in a road accident. Along with him, Sunita Pottam, Gajendra Mandavi, Lakshman Kashyap, and many others remain jailed under fabricated conspiracy charges in a case under the National Investigation Agency resembling the Bhim Koregaon prosecution, a sweeping, unprovable case that has cast a shadow of fear across Bastar's resistance. More recently, 9 more cases have been filed against Raghu and Sunita, who was on the verge of acquittal in many cases that she had been arrested for and was re-arrested in May 2025 in the same NIA case, along with Dashrath, another MBM member, and more cases. Like I said before, many other MBM members continue to live in fear of imminent arrest. Just weeks ago, the Supreme Court of India refused to even admit MBM's plea challenging the ban, effectively endorsing the silence of peaceful indigenous mobilization. But just a few days ago, Chhattisgarh government announced its intention not to renew the ban once the current notification expires on October 30th. However, no commitment has been made regarding the release of MBM members. I now invite Junaid to speak on the struggle for self-determination in Indian Occupied Kashmir and how occupation, militarization, and criminalization converge there as a mode of governance. Thank you, Junaid, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Lotika. I want to start by thanking INSAF India for inviting me today to speak to you all. I grew up in Kashmir. I lived most of my life in Kashmir, but today I'm speaking to you from the United States, where I teach anthropology. I've been writing about the military occupation and political repression in Kashmir for almost 2 decades now. One of the things that I just want to start off by saying is that since 2019, a lot of us who've been writing about Kashmir, who find ourselves outside of Kashmir, have been unable to return home. And those of us who are back in Kashmir have been utterly silenced. And many of our scholars, young scholars, college students, people, writers, journalists who write critically about the violence in Kashmir find themselves either behind bars or silenced in one way or the other. I'm also speaking today in the context of the scrubbing of the internet from Kashmiri voices. The Kashmiri books by Kashmiris and scholars of Kashmir have been banned. There's like literally a disappearance of Kashmiri voice happening as I speak. I just want to briefly today talk to you about what I mean by Kashmiri voices. And second, talk about Kashmir and its historical experience with the Indian state. I won't take too much time, but in the end, I also want to see where the possibilities might lie with us to think through with all of you what we can do together and how we can reinvigorate the idea of the people. So what I call Kashmiri voices is not new. Kashmiris have been writing and speaking for a long time, of course, but their voices were always marginal and marginalized. Before 1990, Kashmiri voices were mostly appearing in the form of Kashmiri literature and basically insurgent literature, literature that was hidden from the state view, literature that existed in the form of poetry, short story writing, and whatnot. But this, of course, within the dominant Indian sort of society, these voices were barely existent, and Kashmiri was imagined as like part of the landscape of Kashmir, like silent and somebody who just like was in the background of the Indian couples hanging around on the Dal Lake and stuff. In the 90s, this voice was completely crushed with the rise of the counterinsurgency war against the People's Movement for Independence. There was a brief space that opened up in 2005, between 2005 and 2008, where Kashmiris somehow, I think the instigation was actually an earthquake that happened along the line of control, which allowed a lot of people, foreign and Indian rights activists, to come to Kashmir. And they found, of course, among other things, dead bodies, mass graves along that line. But it allowed a little bit of an opening to Kashmiris to speak. And and to document the human rights abuses that had been taking place during that time. Of course, the violence against Kashmiri bodies and voices did not stop during this period either. But 2008, there was again there was, in Kashmir we use the term Tehreek. Tehreek is basically translates to movement. Tehreek is the people's movement of Kashmir for their rights and for their emancipation. Its history goes back before 1947, before India and Pakistan were established as states, and it began with the Kashmiris demanding the right to education. I guess like people who are work in the field of Dalit rights and Dalit activism will understand it very well, how important education was for emancipation. And so Kashmiris, primarily Kashmiri Muslims, had been denied education and denied a voice. And so that's what the initial Tehreek was about. Tehreek 1.0 started in 1931, and it transformed into sort of a movement for national liberation, because at that time we were ruled under feudal Hindu monarchy, which was heavily exploitative and a very casteist sort of system. In 1947, then the dynamics changed with the annexation of Kashmir and the division of Kashmir into Indian-controlled and Pakistani-controlled parts, which disrupted life in Kashmir, changed completely the nature of how Kashmiri society was organized, and sort of laid the seeds for the new Tehreek movement, the Tehreek 2.0. I'll return to this in a little bit, but I just wanted to mention why we use the term Tehreek. There's nothing to be scared of. It is precisely what you saw in the video, people talking about their movement, people's movement. So that's what Kashmiri movement has always been about their rights and about their rights to be treated as equal and to right of emancipation. So this movement, gained strength in the 1990s with, of course, it coincided with the launch of the counterinsurgency war that Indian government, started in Kashmir. With our voices that had begun to sort of grow from 2005 and 2008, number of books came out, especially it coincided with the rise of social media. There was, during that time, with Facebook and whatnot, people began to speak about their condition. We actually, learned how to speak in English, so we could reach out to not only our friends in India, Pakistan, as well as the rest of the world, but to address the collective conscience of the world at that time. With the Modi's electoral win in 2014, began the repression against Kashmiri voices. It was basically, it intensified it, like whatever gains we had made in terms of making ourselves visible were sought to be reversed. And then in 2016, with the killing of Burhan Wani, a rebel commander in Kashmir, it led to a tremendous repression. I don't know if you remember the time when Indian forces were using pellet guns on Kashmiris, literally blinding Kashmiris. And then it eventually led to the 2019 events, which was the dissolution of the historical state of Jammu and Kashmir and the revocation of Article 370 and 35A. The return of the BJP that year left Kashmiris utterly in shock and silence. So the totalitarian control in Kashmir has sort of accompanied the full-fledged rise of what, in my work, I call the Hindutva state. Hindutva is no longer simply an ideology or a movement as it used to be, but it has taken over the core areas of the state machinery. It's in bureaucracy, it's sort of become, India presents itself now as represented by this Hindutva. It has entered, of course, it's just dominating the media, and it manifests itself in historical revisionism, as well as like areas that we thought were safe from ideology, even areas like of science. Hindutva state not only refuses to take seriously the interests and claims of those who lie outside the framework of what is called upper caste, upper caste as an entity, but it uses brazen spectacles of domination to institute its power permanently. It's basically trying to, and has, I think, successfully succeeded in scaring everybody into silence. So what I also want to mention here is that for Kashmiris, this Hindutva state is not a new thing. We have experienced Hindutva before 2014 as a state ideology. In fact, pre-1947, the Dogra state that ruled Kashmir for almost a century was primarily a Hindutva state. In fact, it was one of the states that the RSS in 1947 rushed to save because, for the RSS, it was the epitome of what a Hindutva state should look like, a permanent domination of the upper caste over both the undercastes as well as the Muslim. Since 1947, Kashmir has gone through 4 primary modalities of control and domination. From 1947 to 1953 was a period of annexation, where the Indian army arrived in Kashmir, mainly first to sustain the Dogra state, but it found itself immediately, surprised by the interest of the international community and the United Nations, although Nehru was the one who took the case to the United Nations. And so there was a brief period from 1947 to 1953 where there was a little bit of space where Kashmiris had some degree of sovereignty. And during that time, Kashmiris were able to implement some emancipatory provisions like the land redistribution and debt cancellation and things like that. But that moment was interrupted and completely taken over by the Hindu right-wing agitation at that time, which demanded the return to what had existed before 1947. And the Kashmiri leader at the time, not the sole leader, but one of the important leaders of the time, Sheikh Abdullah, was arrested and put behind bars for probably a decade and more, and was only allowed to come back, return to Kashmir after acceding to India's claims on Kashmir. From 1953 to 1990 was a period of colonization. It was a time when the Indian bureaucracy and Indian government slowly took on a creeping control over Kashmiri life. It passed numerous laws that stole away that brief moment of sovereignty and that had existed from 1947 to 1953. The 1990 to 2019 is the era of military occupation. It's the time under which I grew up. Most of my writing is really centered on this time. It's a time when tens of thousands of Indian soldiers arrived in Kashmir, took over any public space, and launched a really, really violent crackdown on Kashmir. Tens of thousands of Kashmiri, mostly young men and women, disappeared. Tens of thousands were killed. Thousands spent decades and decades in jails. As of now, there are people in Indian prisons who have spent like almost 31 years there, and they've never come out since then. They are completely absent from public view in India. And since 2019, we have what I call an emergent settler colonialism, a logic that is centered around taking over land. Although the Indian, government forces had taken over a lot of land in Kashmir since 1947, especially since after 1990, but it sort of instituted into law this right for non-Kashmiris. And when I say Kashmiri, I'm not speaking only about Kashmiri-speaking people. I'm talking about all the historical residents of the state of Kashmir. And these include people who are under Pakistani domination on the other side of the control as well. So since 2019, the Indian government introduced these new set of laws, Domicile Act, a revocation of 35A, which had at least allowed Kashmiri people or the people of Kashmir to have some control over their land. And so what we see now is an era of emergent settler colonialism. During all of these 4 phases of annexation, colonization, military occupation, and settler colonialism, there have been intertwining logics and ideologies at play. Yet at the same time, I distinguish these periods based on what the Indian government or the Indian state needed at that time to take over more and more power over Kashmiri life. For those, when we use the term settler colonialism, or Kashmir scholars use the settler colonialism term, it rankles quite a few, years in India as well. I remember in 2019, I and a few of my colleagues were giving a talk in Madison, Wisconsin, and a very well-meaning liberal Indian, activist, a filmmaker, asked us the question. He said, like, if you spoke as Indians, then Indian people would be able to hear you better. But you speak as Kashmiris, and I was, I think this is what has been a struggle for a lot of activists in India to be able to overcome the received wisdom that comes with certain forms of nationalism, to be able to hear across and listen to people who are dominated under the nationalist sign, and so when he asked this question, I was wondering whether the ruling classes in India, for them, it would have mattered if we spoke as Kashmiris or as Nagas or indigenous Adivasis or Muslims or Sikhs and farmers, Dalits, and anyone else, because they would find another way to control Kashmir. They would find another way to take over our resources, rip apart our mountains, and destroy our forests, and deny us the right to self-determination. So for us, what is utterly visible may not be visible to other people in other places. One of my enduring memories from the 1990s, when I was still a young child, was sometimes we'd have Indian soldiers come and lay a siege to our houses, neighborhoods, and I would see Naga soldiers there. Of course, it was easy to tell people from those regions, and I would see CRPF soldiers sometimes from places like Bastar and Chhattisgarh, and I would see soldiers from Tamil Nadu and many other parts of India, Dalit soldiers whose officers often were not Dalit. They were often upper caste Brahmins and other communities. But it was an enduring memory because I always wondered, why is it that the Indian state is able to bring people from all these different places which are themselves repressed and suppressed, whose resources are being looted, whose countries, whose regions are being dominated, that they are able to bring them to Kashmir. And then when I went back in 2014 to do ethnographic research, I met Kashmiris who had been part of an organization called the Ikhwan, Ikhwan was a group of militants that had been turned, just like Salwa Judum. And I interviewed a bunch of them who had survived, the 2000s, and they told me that they had been deployed for a decade in Bastar, which is what brings me to this idea of the people. Like, who are we as a people? How do we reimagine the idea of people? I'm very inspired by the term Bahujan. The term that's away from its electoral politics, away from the way it sometimes gets used in the framework of so-called democracy. And I think of Bahujan as a term that can be reinvigorated as part of resistance, as part of the resistance against this colonial capitalist upper caste state structure, or the feudal Muslim state of Pakistan. Bahujan, of course, means most people. Bahu, the most. It's not majoritarian. It's not majoritarian in the sense the state sort of can like mobilize people towards repression under the sign of maybe Hindu or Muslim or any other such term that can exist. But Bahujan as a minoritarian principle, the assemblage of all the people that are swarming at the edges, that are swarming against, chafing at the domination that they're facing. Bahujan is an intrinsically organized against domination. Of course, caste domination being central to it. Yet at the same time, it recognizes difference, the difference of not like some essential difference that exists between people, because there is none. But it recognized the difference of historical experience. It recognized that what a Dalit scholar might see as caste domination may appear to Kashmiris or Nagas as an imperial colonial state, and which may appear to a Muslim as a Hindutva nationalism, or to an indigenous Adivasi as a corporate capitalist beast. So I think that what we need to think about is how do we speak across this difference with empathy, without dismissing each other's historical experience. How do we think about, as for instance, wherever you are located, think about Kashmiris outside the framework of the strictures of thought that the nation state places. And so we need to sort of reassemble the idea of the people beyond borders and recognize the internal challenges as well. I mean, for instance, I spent a bunch of time in the early 2000s. I was a student at Aligarh Muslim University. In 2002, when the Gujarat pogroms were taking place, we were trying to organize a protest march. And this was, I think, probably the last year of the BJP rule, the BJP, under the Vajpayee and whatnot. And the university administration basically shut us down, saying that we were going to harm the interests of the university itself. And it became quite obvious to us that the resistance will need to take place outside the institution, the outside of these spaces that are already sort of colonized by the state and its dominant vision of nationalism. In Kashmir right now, Kashmiri, Indian liberal scholars sometimes, or journalists, used to say that Kashmiris are alienated, which was a very reductive way of thinking about what Kashmiris were doing. Kashmiris have, as I said, had a really vigorous, strong, and dynamic movement for emancipation. They were not alienated from, they were pre-alienated from the idea of the nation state. We were never part of we didn't line up either behind Indian National Congress or Muslim League. in 1947. And I imagine a majority of the people, the Bahujan, never lined up behind the Congress or the Muslim League. And so we were not alienated. But what has happened since 2019 is that the Indian state is sort of deliberately now forcing us to be alienated from Kashmir itself as Kashmiris, that to deny us the right to claim that we exist. What 2019 was the Hindutva state's attempt to take not our identity alone, but our connection to the land, our historical connection to our struggle, our history as a people, and to sort of at the same time divide the society, fragment us along ethnic lines. If you are a Kashmiri right now, some of the only Kashmiri voices that are allowed on social media are the ones who speak about ethnic supremacism. The only Kashmiri voices that are allowed on social media now are the ones who are trying to tell women what to do and who to marry and who not to marry. And I wonder always, how is it that any Kashmiri who speaks for the rights of the people, who speaks of right to freedom from violence and political repression, gets immediately their properties get confiscated, they get arrested, their passports get confiscated. But how is it that these other people who speak the language of ethnic supremacism and the language of who are part of this gender injustice discourse, how is it that they are allowed? So
can I just interrupt you here? I was just keeping a check on the time as well. It's been amazing hearing you. I think both from the point of view of continuities and the very fine nuances you've unpicked and linked the areas as you're talking. But if you can just wrap up just now, and we'll come back and question answers. Thank you.
Absolutely. Let me just finish here actually and give Suchitra time. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. I mean, that was a point of segue in a way. Yes, it was coming into civil society. So Suchitra, thank you for being with us. And let me just hand over to you, who you will help us unpack the Indian state's coordinated attempt to suppress and delegitimize civil society and what Ajit Doval once infamously called the fifth column. Thank you so much.
Ritika, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to everyone who's here today who's made this possible, and of course to Junaid for being here. And I also realized that it's been a while since I also heard Junaid speak, and I want to start by echoing some of the things that Junaid said, which is that Kashmir in some ways was such an integral part of me understanding my own political grammar, understanding occupation, understanding what militarization looks like, and what self-determination means on the ground, and what it means for many of us as those of us Indian, to always speak only of Kashmir in terms of human rights, but never in terms of freedom, liberation, or dignity. And it sometimes profoundly breaks my heart to know that so many of these Kashmiri scholars from whom I have learned and continue to learn are no longer either able to speak as they could return home, right? And I just kind of want to start by grounding that the silences that happen, and also why conversations like this are always so important. And that's also why anytime you ask me, I always try and say yes, because even these spaces are now being completely eroded. And we are part of the civil society. So let me just quickly jump into my talk. And what I'm really trying to do today is kind of understand, what does it mean when India's national security, Ajit Doval, declares the civil society as the new frontier of counterinsurgency, or calls it the fifth column. For many of you, a bit of a recap, fifth column really comes out of the Spanish Civil War, where there was a huge propaganda that was put out to call any kind of dissent or resistance as the internal enemy who is about to bring down a community, a nation, often seen as the problematic, the people who are here to threaten the integrity of a nation, collaborators who work with other outside forces to destabilize. So in some ways, the idea of the fifth column is really the idea that that says a group of people as threatening the nation itself. So when India's National Security Ajit Doval declared that civil society is a new frontier of the war, a terrain that can be subverted, manipulated, simply because he claims that this group of the civil society is hurting the interest of the nation. What he is really articulating is, in some ways, a continuity of what Junaid talks about as a Hindu state, an Hindu state that really sees any kind of dissent as securitization of, as any kind of dissent as a problem of internal security. This doctrine reimagines civil society, any kind of discourse. I'm not even talking about disagreement. I'm talking about any kind of discourse as the internal enemy. So the fifth column is again constructed as the idea of threatening the Indian nation itself. And Doval situates this within the framework of what he calls the fourth generation warfare, or which is the counterinsurgency logic. So they're doing two things here, right? One, they're first telling us that civil society is the problem. Civil society is the new enemy. And now that we have identified the enemy, for the longest of time, also let's understand within the logic of the Indian nation states, who has traditionally been the enemy of the state. It's often Pakistan, it's often the figure of the Kashmiri, the figure of the Muslim, the figure of the other who's always seen and created as the terrorist. So now what Doval is doing is that he's kind of bringing this framework of fourth generation warfare, which is a counterinsurgency logic, where now counterinsurgency tactics are deployed not in the hills of Bastar, not just in the borderlands of India, but really the civil society. Again, we see this playing out in places like Kashmir first, in places like India's northeast, where ASFA has been there for a long time. For instance, about 2 years ago, the Indian state designated, for example, a Kashmiri journalist as foreign terrorists or white-collar terrorists. So a lot of what happens here is that we have to understand that whatever Doval and people like Doval are doing is not simply a legal category or analytical category. If you really start asking questions about what the meaning of these things are, you will end up realizing that there is no meaning. But what they're doing is really linguistic gymnastics and really taking the language of fourth generation counterinsurgency logic and saying that the civil society itself is the terrorist, is the enemy, and the traditional battleground of what you saw, the images that were flooded in Indian news streams of Kargil or other things. Now you're saying that war is no longer between the enemies, armies that are expensive and unpredictable, but really it is influencing and controlling civil society. And it kind of says that we are so powerful as this Hindu state that we are going to have absolute control over people, and only by having absolute control over people that we preserve state power, which is a completely new territory in terms, while the Indian state has a long history of repression that we should understand. And I am always against people talking about India as if somehow India changed in 2014 with the coming of Modi. That did not happen. What we are seeing is a deep, long history of violence, but now really what we are saying is that it is not enough that we control the territory. It is not enough that we control your body. It is important that we control your ideas, but we also want to control the capacity and the processes that stops the state from disappearing people, either as citizens or occupied subjects. So one of the things that I just also want to very quickly frame where I'm coming from, so that what I say, it's kind of a framing that we are thinking through, both in my own personal work and the work that we do at Polis Project, is that we now look at all of this as the transformation of the rights-bearing citizen into a rightless body. Of course, in places like Kashmir and other parts, you've never been a rights-bearing citizen, you've always been a rightless body. But here, really, you're looking at the transformation of citizens within mainland India, from at least on paper rights-bearing citizens into rightless bodies that can be disappeared without accountability by the Indian state, enabled by a series of new laws, amendments, but more importantly, the linguistic gymnastics of naming everyone as the enemy of the state or the terrorist. Now, what we are really doing is that in all of this, we have to center the documentation of the juridical violence and its consequences. So it all begins with the linguistic gymnastics of, say, for example, calling civil society as the fifth column, or saying that we need to use counterinsurgency warfare. And now that this language is flooded in public sphere as propaganda, either through social media, rubber stamped through the media, the judiciary then takes this language and in some ways incorporates them into the legal analytical category to create more juridical violence. Unlike traditional analysis, which really locates erosion of civil liberties within the realm of rights, we argue that bodies have existed in democracy to become something else. And I think that with the kind of the things that we will go through, you will see what is happening to the figure of the citizen. Here, as I said, laws are created to form social exclusion, in which vast populations are subjected to living conditions that confer upon them conditions that make their disappearances possible. Junaid spoke about disappearances of Kashmiri voices, of archives, of ideas, of bodies. So the disappearance is no longer just the body, it is the entire spectrum of disappearances that we are really thinking about. Now, the counterinsurgency logic and policing of civil society, as I said, this doctrine imports the method that is usually reserved for military counterinsurgency into everyday governance of civilians. So if you look at it at civil society, broadly, who constitutes civil society, right? Civil society is you and me. It is activists, it's students, it's journalists, it's nonprofits. And all of these people are no longer citizens or rights-bearing bodies engaged in dialogue. I'm not even going to use the word dissent because dissent was criminalized long ago. Even the idea of existing and having a dialogue is now being criminalized. So you become potential insurgents. You become subversives in the eyes of the police, the policy, and the security establishment. The police, in Dowell's framing, must then view their role as protectors, not just from external enemies, but also from the fifth column of threats. Such counterinsurgency logic basically divides the population into the loyal and the hostile groups, with dissent being treated as sabotage. And I think what lends legitimacy to this repression is again framed as necessary to protect the national security, even when protests in question are peaceful. For example, one of the things, and we will discuss it in a bit, is that one of the things that you saw after the anti-CAA protests is a series of arrests that happen. And something called FIR 59 gets filed against a lot of the student activists like Natasha Narwal and many others, where the act of gathering, what FIR 59 does effectively is it makes, the act of gathering as now a criminal offense. So what you're really seeing is that even before a crime is, the idea of a pre-crime is committed, you are taking everyday acts of existence, of being a citizen, having an opinion, gathering together as criminal acts. And I think that is where we are at this that is where we are in terms of the moment now. Now, how do we think through these as, how do we understand this within the examples that have already played out before us? First, of course, I think in terms of a moment for us to understand is the moment of the anti-CAA protest that happens. What you really see is, and of course, in student movements, especially in Jamia Millia and JNU and other places, become important sites. Of course, places like Hyderabad University. Really, what you see is the anti-CAA protests and the coming together of students across campuses and the beginning of understanding how even in liberal campuses, segregation of ideas happen. And you see this anti-CAA moment as a moment of rupture where so many of the political differences in ideologies somehow seem to be the capacity to speak to each other across differences begins to happen, which again is a threat to any state. So what you see in terms of practical signs of policing is targeting of dissent. With the anti-CAA protest in 2019, millions of citizens voiced concerns about the discriminatory citizenship laws. The government then responds through mass arrests. It responds through detaining 1,500 students. Many are charged under various laws. Of course, UAPA then becomes the single most powerful tool to arrest students. Institutions like Jamia and other many remain imprisoned without trials. Really, what we have normalized since 2019 is the state's capacity to just pick up someone and hold them indefinitely. Of course, the most famous of examples that are often cited is Sharjeel Imam, Omar Khalid, but there are many others. Many students, especially Muslim activists and students who remain incarcerated, who might not be as well known, but again remain incarcerated for years, simply going from one bail hearing to another. Another incident that I want people to kind of think back is the moment when in Jamia Millia University, police walked in and not only unleashed violence in front of camera. Again, another thing you see is that now it's very common for the state to commit illegal atrocities in front of camera. And despite evidence of wrongdoing, that video is circulated and repeated, not as proof of violence or complicity, but as forms of policing. So again, you see students being violently attacked, activists being detained, and universities that are historically seen as spaces of some kind of free thought as against anything else are again recast as insurgency zones where dissent must be crushed. And also, let's understand that let's also not think of universities as these perfect spaces where dissent was already possible. No, in reality, many liberal universities and campuses across India and South Asia have to negotiate this very difficult space between what they see is permissible dissent and what they see is dissent that is not permissible at all. And in some ways, students who have been navigating these for many years saw that space kind of even crush smaller and become smaller and smaller. The second group that gets targeted, of course, within the thing are marginalized groups, but also labor unions and organizations. And what we're really seeing is various groups, whether they're Muslims, Dalits, Bahujans, Christians, Adivasis, communities that have historically faced systemic discrimination, now again face a different kind of layer of oppression. And one of the things that constantly a metaphor that would come up when I would do interviews with people is that the idea of the state's boot always being on your neck. That traditionally how the Indian state's boot has always been on the neck and how communities often navigate life with that boot on their neck. Sometimes the boot slightly eases up, but really existence. And that is an interesting metaphor that gets used by communities across India who have historically faced a lot of violence. In recent years, the government's response to any kind of labor union protests, again, has been to securitize that dissent and call it a national security issue. Labor protests demanding fair wages, those opposing privatization, trade union activists, again, have been charged with UAPA. What you're really seeing is a climate of legal harassment that is compounded by ongoing violence from far-right extremist groups, which are again emboldened by state inactions. And really what you're seeing is normalization of lack of due process, normalization of a certain kind of cruelty, normalization of violence, but more importantly, to act with absolute impunity and never be held accountable for all of these actions that are very clearly not only illegal and unconstitutional, but grotesquely violent. Again, what you see is the targeting of grassroots activists. You see targeting of journalists, but mostly vernacular journalists. So it kind of goes back to the idea that you are taking away people's right to bear witness, to exist, to document, and more importantly, transmit those ideas across your communities. That goes back to the idea of holding on the capacity to control everything. Today, the Hindu state sees control as absolutely important to even to function as a governing system. And of course, in this last year, Operation Kargar, which is really looking at going after and militarizing, responding with a certain kind of militarization to tribal resistance. We're also seeing other global strategies of what's happening in Palestine for the last few years being reproduced in Bastar. We've heard stories of drones that have been used to annihilate and maim Palestinians now being used in Bastar. We still need more information on what kinds of technologies are being imported, but that reporting still hasn't come out. But I think we do know and see so much of the tactics of annihilation and genocide and mass deaths that are happening elsewhere being brought over to Bastar, to other places. Of course, Kashmir has been one of the first instances where you see this. I remember being in West Bank in 2009, and I didn't come to Kashmir till 2014. And even as I was traveling through from Srinagar into places, you can immediately recognize that the infrastructures of occupation that were already in place in West Bank and Palestine in 2009 were already being reproduced and built out in Kashmir in 2014. Now in 2025, you see similar infrastructures of occupations and mass death being reproduced. And I think what we have to understand is that we are militarizing every response to dissent and disquiet. That then kind of brings us to this global moment in which we have to understand that what Dole really does is blurring of the line between armed insurgents, civilian dissenters. Again, for me, I am not of the school of thought that differentiates between armed resistance and nonviolence. I believe that oppressed people have the right to resist their oppressors in whatever means possible. I know that is not an opinion that a lot of scholars do, and there is a very clear distinction between violent resistance and non-violent resistance, which I understand a lot of people make those distinctions. I do not. For me, I do believe that communities under immense violence, occupation have the right to resist their occupation, which is enshrined not only in international law, but also that's inalienable in many ways. So for me, that blurring of this line is really the securitized state confronting its own people with tools of war. So for me, that distinction no longer matters, is because it doesn't matter if you use armed resistance, if you're using nonviolent protest. The state, a securitized Hindu state, will confront its own people with tools of war. And often now, mass death is no longer just about disciplining people. Capacity to kill people is also going to become the next frontier of capitalistic extraction. If slavery is what propelled capitalistic expansion 150, 200 years ago, the capacity to annihilate people in mass is what is going to propel the next form of industrial revolution or technological revolution. And really what you're seeing in terms of your AI technologies of violence is really the capacity to kill. So a securitized state, again, I'm repeating this, and a securitized state will confront its own people, either people who it considers its citizens or subjects, not because they're dissenting or disagreeing, because capacity to kill is also going to be the capacity to extract more capital. I wanted to briefly talk about the reproduction of these techniques across the US, because what we saw in India is now in some ways also being reproduced in the US through Trump administration, and ICE, again, has a long, long history, didn't begin with Trump. Perhaps that is something that we can discuss during the Q&A. Finally, I think things for us to really think about is going back to two things. One, I think it is important for us to articulate the current moment with as much clarity as possible. So naming the beast and defining it as precisely as possible is what is going to give us the capacity to understand how then we survive this. The second thing is, given this moment of absolute closure, how do we think through resistance, especially in a way in which dissent itself has been securitized? And for me, those answers change on a daily basis. But I think I'll kind of bring my, I think that is a conversation. I don't want to talk about resistance in a way in which I am giving this thing, but I think that is a conversation that has to happen in a more collective way. And I'll kind of bring my talk to an end.
Thank you so much, both of you. That was intense, but also things we know, but again, some things which we don't say many times. And like I think, Suchitra, you ended by saying, being clear about calling out the beast and in very clear terms. And also, I suppose, yes, clarifying resistance, but also you are right that all of us are not in a position and can't claim to be in that position of determining what that resistance has to be like, and it is then about for those of us in those privileged positions to have that humility to follow as well. Perhaps we also need to constantly think about that. So thank you so much. I'm glad that you both talked in depth, because that was needed, but we do still have enough time for questions. So I can see a couple of questions already in the chat. So we'll start with those, and we can always come back to me or if any other people from the organizing team sort of want to ask. So Junaid, there's a question for you, and you may have read it already in the chat, but I can read it out again. It was sobering to hear you speak about the oppression of the people of Kashmir, that the oppression that people of Kashmir go through under the occupation, and our complicity as Indians in the oppression. Do you see a class dimension in people's struggle against the occupation? Is the struggle against occupation, struggle for self-determination in Kashmir today intertwined with resource extraction and questions of land?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think there's a question before that as well that sort of asks about the resource extraction. So yeah, I guess, well, so when 2019 took place, August 5, 2019, and there was no internet, complete communication blockade, all the Tehreek activists, tens of thousands of them were put behind bars, and the pro-India parties like PDP and in National Conference, their leaders were also put in a hotel for what is called house arrest. The very next morning, people in Shopian, people in Islamabad, Anantnag, and elsewhere noticed that there had been overnight these giant earth movers, the JCBs, arrived and started extracting from the riverbeds. These were JCBs that seem to have been almost like ready, waiting for these actions to take place. That how could they arrive? They don't move so fast, but how did they arrive the very next morning? And what they were extracting was sand for the riverbeds, from the riverbeds. I remember, like, I saw Suchitra in Kashmir in 2014. I think it was just around the time of the flood that we were sort of got caught up in. And at that time, one of the big issues was that the neighborhood I was living in got completely flooded. And the reason was that over the years, the infrastructure that was built around the rivers was made deliberately weaker to protect the military sites, which was across the river from where I was living at that time. And these JCBs, the instruments of ecocide, that you'll find in elsewhere, these in Israel-Palestine context too. As they began arriving, it caused a huge fear among people. But what they were doing was extracting sand, and for many people who may not know, there's enough writing, but I guess it's sort of escaped attention in India that sand mafia in India is one of the most organized mafias in the country, very well connected with the ruling BJP, very well connected with regional actors. And they started digging in. And this sand is considered quite valuable because this is the freshwater sand, river water sand. This is not the same as the sand that you get from, it's crucial to construction. And all of this sand was transported back to northern India, to sites like Gurgaon and Noida, where construction was taking place. Kashmiri forests, at the same time when these laws were being revoked, Article 35A, the sort of the communities of people, especially the Pahari and Gujar communities in the forested areas in the mountains of Kashmir, they were told that they no longer should sort of forage in the forests. This is their entire life system. Their entire culture and society depends on the forest, and they are caretakers of that forest. They have lived with the forest for generations upon generations. They were told that they needed to be moved away. Police arrived there in their communities, pushing them out, throwing their utensils away. At the same time, there's an enormous extraction of timber from uplands of Kashmir. This is a region which is ecologically very fragile. These are places very close to glaciers. The entire river system of South Asia, especially the rivers that flow into Indus, depend on these forests. So what we witnessed in 2019 was, as part of the emergence of the settler colonialism, was the beginning of ecocide in Kashmir. The leveling of land. Recently Modi inaugurated this highest sort of railway bridge. And if you go through that area, if you look at the mountains that they have dug up, the utter destruction that they have caused in this region, totally not needed. Nobody wanted it. Nobody asked for it. But they just wanted to build tunnels through the mountains, primarily to supply troops, primarily for pilgrims to be able to go to Pahalgam and Amarnath. One of the other things that has happened is that the Indian government has sought to destroy modes of livelihood in Kashmir, which do not depend on the government. For instance, apple orchards, walnut orchards, they being leveled to create space for trains that go to Pahalgam, and nobody has asked for it. This infrastructure is built and overlain over a territory that has been preserved for centuries upon centuries, and now is being completely demolished in the name of course, development, which is no development at all. I know the other part of the question was about class struggle, but I just wanted to say quickly that, yes, of course, these are all class struggles. It just depends on how we imagine class. The Tehreek that I was talking about earlier was the struggle of the underclasses, in Kashmir, which is the majority of the population, which is the Kashmiri Muslims. Were not just defined by their religious identity, which was a part of it, but they were mostly the landless peasantry, the working classes in Kashmiri factories who had been oppressed. So the religious question in Kashmir has always been entwined with the question of class.
Thank you so much. And thank you for picking up the question, which I just happened to miss. And like you said, but they tie in together. So both of them you've answered really well. Thank you. So Suchitra, let's go to you now. And again, I think there are two questions. And I think, I'm looking at the time also. So we may as well take them together. I'll read them both out just for everyone to hear. So yeah, thank you for the great talk. I wanted to ask you about your work with NATO during your research in Afghanistan and how it affects the work you do around criminalization of resistance in India, given Western imperialism embedded in NATO. So that's the first question. And the second is, throughout the talk, you refer to the state as Hindu state. Do you differentiate between Hindutvavadi state and the Hindu state? If yes, how do you see it? I mean, I know that Junaid also talked of Hindutva state, and possibly, yeah, that's something we can think of. And yeah, over to you, though, for your comments, please. You're muted, sorry.
So just a quick clarification. I didn't work for or work with NATO. I've never been paid by them. So what I did was the US, when the war in Afghanistan was happening, had something called the embedding system, in which you could go embed with the US Army to either be as a journalist or as a researcher. Again, I was never paid by the US Army. I've never worked. I was there to do research on the US counterinsurgency practices on borderlands. And the only way for me to be in Paktika province was to be part of the embed. And my work has always been critical of American presence in the region. And then the only way I could get access to how this region worked was through the embed process, where I was a researcher and I also was a photographer. And some of that research became part of my graduate thesis, and other part of it became the opening chapter of Midnight's Borders. So just the clarification is that never worked for Afghanistan, never worked for NATO, never worked for the US Army, never been paid by them. And whatever work I've done in those spaces have been to be very critical of what it means to think about this militarized presence in these regions. And of course, all Western imperialism and its militarized armies are deeply complicit in the annihilation of these communities. And I think any of us who was in these spaces cannot be reporting this as, or writing about this as, a both sides issue. We look at the violence, we look at who's causing the violence, and we have to prioritize the communities that come into the violence. I hope that answers the question. I was using the Hindu state as defined by Junaid, because Junaid had already laid out the idea of the Hindu state. And I think I use that definition in ways of talking about it. And my understanding of it, and the reason I used the word, because Junaid used it, and I found it as both as an analytical and intellectual concept that I agree with and use, is often there is a need to differentiate between how the Indian state the Indian state, which is democratic, secular, and republic, is somehow different from the Hindutva ideology that is pervasive. And the idea that that is indeed not the case, but the state and the ideology have fused. Many would argue that it's been the case from the moment of independence, and others would have different opinions on it. But I think that idea that the ideology, the violent Hindutva, again, not Hindutva, because I also feel that Hindutva now has been emptied out of any powerful analytical category you could give it, is that this is a violent state ideology. So for me, when I think about the Hindu state, it's a violent state ideology that is based on the hierarchies of people and uses violence as a very specific way to punish, to control, to discipline, appropriate, not only Adivasi lands, but lands of people it dominates. So now you take that ideology, it is not just the ideology in which which is not just a WhatsApp in which someone says anti-Muslim things, right? It is a core ideology that has been now fused with the state. And that definitional category that Junaid uses is something that I find very helpful, and I just used it. And of course, since Junaid uses it and defined it, I would maybe refer to Junaid in terms of how he conceptualized it, but this is how I use the Hindu state when I talk about the Hindu state.
Yeah, thank you so much. There is actually one more question which was DM'd also to me. I would like to ask that myself as well. So this is about civil society, but open to both of you. In that, again, we have been talking about the strategies of, the Hindutva/Hindu at the moment state violence. And can we reflect on how the state manages to reproduce its hegemonic discourse within the so-called civil society? civil society, and thereby secure the impunity it enjoys. I believe that the impunity of the state is, in fact, the impunity granted to it by society itself. That's what the question is. Yeah, so Suchitra, maybe first, and Junaid, there is actually one more question. Maybe we can. No, we can take that. That can be the last question then after this one.
No, I think Junaid should take it because it looks at local elites with Kashmir, and maybe
Okay.
Junaid. I can...
Yeah, that one I'll read. I thought I'll take it separately, but I'll read it out now only, and we can do both together. Exactly. So can you tell us about the Indian state's reliance on neoliberal actors and local elites within Kashmir to achieve its aim of enforcing control in finance, economy, and agriculture? And actually, in some ways, they're tied in together as well when somebody's talking about impunity being granted by society. Exactly. So, yeah.
Yeah, let me quickly. I think that both are very interesting questions. But when I speak about the Hindutva state, I don't call it a Hindu state or Hindutvawadi state or a Hindu nationalist state. I'm just simply referring to it as Hindutva state, primarily the way it was imagined by RSS leaders like M.S. Golwalkar and V.D. Savarkar. What kind of state they wanted? A state inspired by Nazi Germany, a state where which was built on what Suchitra rightly called a logic of hierarchy. It, of course, makes strategic alliances or to paper over internal differences. For instance, RSS has always wanted to some kind of like a strategic, calm related to sort of caste differences. But it always has to envision an enemy that, for instance, for the Hindutva state right now, the enemy is like on one side is Pakistan, which is like, of course, the bête noire since 1947, that it can invoke any time during elections. In 2019, Modi did very well invoking that. He talks about all of those strikes and whatnot. Then there is the internal enemy, the Muslim, the Indian Muslim, who is supposed to be, who can never be Indian. Then there is the Kashmiri Muslim. Kashmiri Muslim is on the borders, so it's always like threatening the integrity of India. And then there is the sort of the broader Muslim outside, with whom like there can be different kinds of like alliances with, for instance, Modi does not mind getting medals and prizes from UAE, for instance. So you have a Hindutva state that's organized around the figure of this Muslim, a Muslim as someone who can be invoked any time to paper over internal differences and to sort of avoid talking about questions of inequality in India, both material inequality. India is probably one of the most unequal societies when it comes to the distribution of wealth. And to also use it as a way to sort of erase the questions of sort of caste struggles, the questions of emancipation struggles. So that's what I mean by Hindutva state. It uses these spectacles of domination. I think that this is probably, of course, violence against Muslims, Dalits used to happen before 2014 as well, but it was often hidden. And now the activists themselves are like taking videos and pictures of this violence that they perpetrate. And this is happening in Kashmir as well, where bodies of Kashmiris, their houses getting blown, are displayed openly as a form of punishment, punitive disciplining of dissent, that this could potentially happen to you as well if you speak. So that's one of the ways I think about the Hindutva state. The question of the internal actors in Kashmir, yes, of course, in the 1990s, one of the key strategies of the counterinsurgency war was to create what I, in my own work, call an uncivil society. It's an uncivil society is a figure that just, I draw on the work of Gramsci to talk about civil society as something that is a layer between the state and the people, that is often liberal, often trucks with the state, and often sort of mollifies any resistance practices. But in Kashmir, what the Indian state did was to create an uncivil society, a society, a small layer of people who became sort of the glove on the bayonet of the Indian state, who would be used to target their own people. These included like some militant groups like Ikhwan I had mentioned earlier, but these also included politicians, pro-India politicians. It also included actors, marginal actors, who were then given enormous amount of money, basically to target people, to create plausible deniability. I mean, some of you who may not know the history of the 90s very well, in mid-90s, there was a huge upsurge of this discourse of human rights activism and human rights. I think it has something to do with Bill Clinton and his change of foreign policy. And so the Indian government became very concerned about the reports that were coming out of Kashmir. So they created these groups to primarily create plausible deniability. And it's these actors who have become the mediators of this current moment as well. They contest elections, but they have no power. They even win elections, but they are unable to institute any policy. But they continue to have enormous access to wealth. But it's a very tiny minority. I mean, it's people who get on the Indian news channels and who are given space, and who then just like often would say that, of course, treat us like we are Indian nationalists, but we want this little thing and that little thing for Kashmir. They are embedded within the Indian state system. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Suchitra. Thank you.
I just want to kind of go back to this moment that happened in 2019, 2020, when there were these anti-CAA protests. I want to use an example. I mean, when these protests, and one of the organizers of this protest said, and this was like soon after the Jamia had happened, we had seen incredible violence being unleashed. And this was in Madras when I was there, and maybe there was a protest. And one of the organizers of the protest said, bought a bunch of roses and said, okay, why don't we go hand out roses to these cops? And I was just sitting there going, but why? Why are we handing out roses to these cops? And then it was like, no, we just have to make sure that, next time they give us permission to protest. And I was like, we should not be getting permission to protest. Civil disobedience is, in some ways, is effective when people's rage and sense of injustice and indignation come together to create. Civil disobedience is not supposed to be perfect. We're not supposed to get permission. It's supposed to be, the messiness and the anger is supposed to come together. And I think, in my sense, I think a lot of what we see today in terms of the neoliberalization is that, even before neoliberal policies, what is liberalism? Liberalism as an idea is an idea that will talk about individual freedom, human rights, but really it's a system that is wedded to the idea of capitalistic accumulation, that somehow capitalistic accumulation in the name of development is the only salvation. It really does not care about, it'll talk about human freedom, but never human dignity, right? And that's why we end up in these things where the people who are organizing these anti-CAA protests are running pillar to post, getting permission to protest. We are placating the very officers who are, why give this rose? What did you get from the, why is this need to be this constant negotiator, to just have enough approval of the state? And I think it's those moments, I feel, that truly dilute our capacity to resist. I was again in India this summer, and we wanted to we want to do an event. And interestingly, often the current administration in Tamil Nadu is seen as the bulwark against fascism. But I came to realize that almost all public spaces in Chennai today, to have an event, you first need to go to the police, write an affidavit, sign it, saying that we will have no political conversation. And I'm like, literature is political. All literature is political. How am I supposed to file an affidavit saying that a book event will not have any political discussion, sign it, take it to the police officer will sign it, and I then take that letter back to an organizer, the venues organizer. Again, Chennai has a lot of public venues, it has a lot of private venues. Both of them demand these affidavits in which the police is already giving you permission, where you've already in some ways surrendered your right to it. I mean, and it is that kind of everyday erosion of civil dignity, right? Your dignity, your capacity as a writer, as an individual, that I feel is what really erodes, and that is the complicity of that. In some ways, maybe it's uncivil, is maybe civil, but it really is when we keep acquiescing for every little demand, every little thing. And then I was like, no, I'm not going to do this. I will never sign a letter where I say I will not discuss anything political. In order to get what exactly, right? And I think that is the pipeline that I am most concerned about. It is those, once you listen to agree for these small indignities and humiliations of concession, then it becomes easier for you to stay silent. And for me, that I know I've not thought about it quite clearly, but this is what really came to my mind when that question was put to me.
Thank you so much. Being mindful of the time, I am going to stop the question answer session here now and bring the session to a close. Thank you both very much. I'll have to do that a few times because it was amazing. Let me just summarize what we've been through the session, and everything we went through returned in the end to that question which ran through the conversation in the series was, what does it mean when the very act of resistance, of speaking, assembling, or asserting rights is turned into a crime? And you both really, the discussion was very rich on that. So across, and in our in the talks, of course, across Bastar and in Indian Occupied Kashmir, two very seemingly different theaters with, yes, distinct histories. And throughout India's civic sphere, as Suchitra showed us, we have seen how violence has become embedded in governance and is framed through the language of security, development, and national interest. It ran through all these three places. And of course, it's in the places we did not include because it's a huge area. What we confront is not disorder, but design, a system that sustains itself through dispossession and fear. And that, yes, you talked about that as well. But that the violence has never also gone uncontested, whether it's the Adivasi youth in Bastar, the people in Kashmir, and countless others across India continuing to resist, often at unimaginable cost. So thank you once again to you, Junaid and Suchitra, for your uncompromising insights, and to everyone who joined us today in this conversation and have stayed till now. For those of us outside India, I would say, listening from the relative safety of the diaspora, our responsibility does not end here. To witness is not enough. We need to witness, of course, as a first step, but it's not enough. We must translate awareness into action, such as by committing to keep these conversations alive, to connecting movements, and to confronting the global systems that make this violence possible. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you are, and in solidarity always. I'll end the session here. Thank you so much.